You know, folks, sometimes I am so out of my league with a guest that it's not even worth my breath to explain why. So I'll just read my guest resume and you'll understand. Dr. Maxi Heitmayer is a social psychologist at the London School of Economics working on the situated use of technologies and especially smartphones. He has a PhD in psychological and behavioral science from the London School of Economics and political science, a Master's of Science in Social and Cultural Psychology from the London School of Economics, and a Master's of Arts in International Relations from Jacobs University, not to mention his undergrad degrees. On top of all that, he has a voice that will leave every listener swooning. Ladies and gentlemen, live from London, Dr. Maxi Heitmayer. Dr. Heitmayer, welcome to the Aro Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Joey. If you're just listening, you will see that I have slightly blushed from that introduction. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you again very much for having me and for all the putting all these accolades out there. I guess I have to live up to that now.
I literally just read your resume. There was nothing on top of the voice, but I just read your resume. That was it. Just the facts spoke for themselves there. Well, your blushing will match most of our listeners as they listen to your great accent there. So, Dr. Heitmayer, you mentioned, or in your resume, I want to read it again. You are a social psychologist at the London School of Economics, and you're working on the situated use of technologies and especially smartphones. Will you explain for the layperson like myself, what does that mean? I want to get into how you got into it, but what exactly does that mean, the situated use of technologies and especially smartphones?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before, if that's okay, Maxi's really just fine. You know, I'm already blushing enough, right? And for everyone listening in, right, Maxi's just fine. All these titles, you know, we have devised a couple hundred years ago, but really it just meant that I spent too many summers in the library. What does it mean? I guess this research and this work comes from a curiosity, about what we do with our everyday lives, and how we make decisions. And for anybody having done research before or currently pursuing a PhD, it also is always a bit of therapy as well. There's catharsis in there. You do it because you have an issue, a problem that you need to fix yourself. So I always like to refer back to Habermas, who's one of the big sociologists who's written sort of the most discussed and currently used models on communication. And it is my understanding from Wikipedia, as I've been told this story anecdotally, that he had a cleft as a child. And so back in the day, it was much more difficult to treat this. And so while after he had received treatment in, his early years, he wasn't able to speak to his comrades, to his classmates for a while. And so they were being very mean and nasty to him and just, living life, and he couldn't participate. And that guy then goes on to write the theory about communication. And so I think as a starting point from sort of my perspective, why I'm really in this is because I was one of the first generations when phones started to become smarter and internet access became more ubiquitous. And I found myself glued to these things in the middle of the night, and it's very problematic. And so when you have a problem, you might want to try to fix it. And eventually someone was kind enough to give me a PhD for that.
So that's interesting. So you did in your undergrad degrees, it kind of grew as you grew with studies. And it's interesting to me to have the realization that, I can make a vocation out of this. This can be my life's work. How did that, because I'm sure it began with, like you said, a pain point and then grew to a curiosity. But what was that like when you said, hey, this is such a rich field that I can pursue my doctorate in, and I can base my vocation on this? What was that process like?
Yeah. I think it depends on the field that you're in. I can only comment on the social sciences, not the real sciences. But it's become very fluid recently, and there's a lot of arguments being put forward for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, also putting together social sciences and natural sciences and everything. I think we can probably all agree that this is a good idea. But in that sense, sort of, I'm a child of this development, and I entered the academy at a point in time where there still were disciplinary differences, in the sense that disciplines so closely related like sociology and psychology wouldn't speak to each other, and would refer to basically the same ideas, but referring back to the same founding fathers, who had just found different names for the same thing. And so there was very little interaction and exchange. And I sort of joined when things became more interdisciplinary, and people are very open to this now. And so when you're in the social sciences, then you end up being very flexible where you go. I was like most people, I suppose, not very motivated after school, and also not very clear about what I wanted to do. And I had relatively good grades, or rather I had okay grades, but they were the same for everything really. So I also couldn't say I'm better at this or I'm worse at this. And so I just decided that I didn't receive, or I didn't have an extensive political education in my high school. And I thought, you know what better place to learn something about politics and sort of society than at university. And if you don't end up being, if this doesn't end up being your vocation afterwards, then at the very least, you know a little bit more about how to be a citizen of the society, how you can participate. And so in this very fertile ground, we were then given a lot of different ideas, a lot of different thinkers. And for me, the starting point that really, when things started to click, or rather the gears started connecting, was, and I'm going to give you another old German guy now, and I guess you've mentioned the accent already for those who haven't figured it out by now. We actually didn't read that much German stuff, to be honest. But it's the guy's called Georg Simmel. He's one of the founding fathers of sociology. And he wrote this essay in 1903 called The Metropolis and Mental Life. It's a very good read, and in the sense it's only 10 pages, so I can recommend it to everyone, but it's 10 very dense pages. And at the time, working on politics, working on international relations, that was the time when drones were new, UAVs, and everything was very techy, and you're trying to kind of see what's going on currently. But then looking backwards, reading this paper, it's now 120 years old, and he observed how people were moving to the big cities back in the day. And as you can imagine, big cities back in the day are nothing compared to what we're living on now. And he had this very banal observation that all of a sudden, it's not enough anymore to be a baker, because there's 5 bakers. And so it's not enough to say, hey, I sell bread, which already is sort of a step up from we look after ourselves. It's, okay, I only sell bread, and then I trade my stuff for other people's stuff. So we don't all have to, produce all the stuff we need individually, and we can focus on producing better stuff. No, it's not enough that I'm the baker. I need to compete. So I need to bake bread. It has to be good. And I also need to communicate to other people around me that indeed my bread is the best bread. And the same applies to sausages and clothes and all the other things that, mainly bread and sausages for Germans, right? But these things that people were peddling. And at the same time, on the way to the bakers, from your exhausting sort of Fordist assembly line job, you were almost run over by the new development cars. And there were traffic lights and neon lights and ads. And so there were 2 processes that he observed. One is the constant overstimulation of the mind, a dulling down, sort of say a blasé outlook, because it's just too much to deal with. And the other thing was a commodification of things, because I don't know people around me. I cannot know anybody anymore. I cannot even know of them anymore, because in the prior societies you would at least heard of someone who that is. So I cannot trust in stuff like social facilitation and knowing other people. I cannot trust in all of that anymore. So what I really have is money, and that was the common denominator that we went down to. So if you give me money for my service and I give you money, and we don't try to steal each other's money, and I also don't need to worry about how good or bad your service is or your product, because I can immediately break it down to its monetary value, then things flow much more fluently in these larger agglomerations and these sort of monkeys that we are, that live in anthills at the end of the day. But that also comes at, again, a very strict commodification of relations, of breaking down things. And together, these 2 things, of one, the overstimulation, the other thing of the simplification and very reductionist approach to social relationships, that made me think about my social media, on how much as a little sort of late teenager, or in my early 20s, how much I cared about getting the likes and the followers on Instagram, and how much I cared about sort of being connected and talking to people. And that's sort of when things started forming. And then if you have a eureka moment like this, then I'm sure there's great opportunity to start developing a career and a vocation from this. And of course, there's a bias, because when you tell the story in hindsight, then
Sure.
everything's clear and everything makes sense. But I'm absolutely sure that if you have a realization like this, and anybody can, then there's great opportunity to try to turn this into something that's your passion. And that doesn't have to be academically.
Is it so this has been and that's such an issue, the overstimulation of the mind and the oversimplification of social relations, those two things working together. And this is a 1903 essay that observed this. So is this, we look as a society now, and I think a lot of people who listen, a lot of people who are members of Aro, our families, it almost feels a little bit hopeless, that, what's happening with smartphones and the distraction and all of that, but it's not a new phenomenon. So should that make us, I don't know if this question makes sense, but should that make us more hopeful that we've been through it before, or less hopeful that it always repeats itself? Do you know what I mean? As a society,
Yeah.
does that should inspire
Hegelian
hope
question.
or hopelessness?
Yeah, it's a very Hegelian question where we're going with this. To be honest, I don't know, because there's different factors involved in this as well, right? While we are staring into our phones, there are other things happening around us that perhaps are more profound, than how much sleep we're losing. But they're very clearly, and I think it's a very astute observation, there's two things that we need to separate. One is the activity that's taking place in this media that we're engaging with, and then there's the medium itself that we're dealing with. And I think the earlier discussion, because we're now talking about how much time we spend and how, where we direct our attention, but move back maybe 8 to 10 years, the main discussion around social media was around body image. And it typically was the narrative of our poor little teenage girls are being exposed to too many Photoshop models, right? Now we're in the fortunate point that the same pressure is increasingly also put on young boys, right?
Right.
So we're creating equality, but in the wrong direction. But you could make the argument that teenage magazines in the 90s with the Spice Girls or or TLC or whoever you had on there had the same effect. What's different is the immediacy. Now, I'm not a media scholar and a media historian, but I also believe that paintings, oil paintings back in the day when they were accessible, or Jane Austen novels or whatever, also had a similar effect, and people occupied themselves with it. So in terms of the social element, there is a repeating element there, and I think it's very hard to get this out of society, but this is something that we probably can discuss, and we can see where we want to go. The other question then is the question of the medium, of the format. I don't know how it is where you are, but we have all these in London. So I live in London, and there are endless memes about the tube and how you're not allowed to make eye contacts with public transport, right? We call it tube here because
Sure.
it's tubular. Get it?
Mind the gap. Sure.
Yeah, that stuff. And so on the tube, you're not allowed to look into people's eyes, and everybody says, "Oh God, with smartphones, everybody's just on their smartphone." But there's beautiful black and white images from the '60s where everybody's just hiding behind newspapers. Right. So the interesting question is, we don't want to engage with people around us, and we don't like people. At the same time, this is not how we got off the trees, right? By ignoring the other monkeys around us. So this is sort of like the larger level question. So I'm derailing a little bit. But what I wanted to get back to now is that once the newspaper magazine is sold, the people printing them and selling them to you don't have an interest in you looking at them anymore, right? Perhaps as a legacy or whatever. And the same with books before. But the problem now is that the medium itself wants us to continue to engage and to participate. And it's not just an innocent object that lies there, but it's active and it's changing, and it's focused on one device. And so I think then we could probably have another discussion in that direction, to see whether indeed there is something that's different and new, I don't think this is necessarily bound to the content that we consume, but it's very much due to the medium and the format in which we consume it.
And it's that, to your point on even on the first one, it's the immediacy, and that immediacy creating the deluge. It's because of the immediacy that it's nonstop, right? And to your point, it's ever changing, and so that's where you get into stuff that you understand much better than I. But the neurotransmitters and dopamine, and just always looking for something, always constantly in the hunt of something new, right? I mean, is that I assume that's a factor of the fact that it's ever evolving. Then it's starting to hit different areas of our brain for that reason, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a neuro scientist,
Sure.
but we all know the basic findings on slot machines and on gambling. We know that that's problematic. We also all know that all the smart people from the West Coast have studied this, and they've studied operant conditioning, and all the apps that we like to use, Uber and food delivery and whatever. They're constantly A/B testing live things. So I think this is clear, and this is obvious.
And so with that, there's no sign that it's going to slow down. There are no signs that the developers are going to all of a sudden have an epiphany where they say, let's stop making it ever new and evergreen, and that's not even that's not even nefarious, right? This whole notion of bringing new things to you, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think people in in the Sierra Club are trying to look for new ways to help the environment, and that's not a bad thing. But then you do have the bad side of it, and so I want to get to your thesis. I mean, your PhD thesis, I think, proposed a how do we begin to reduce our screen time. And so I want to address that. I don't want to get too deep in a wormhole here, but is the issue, would you say the issue is, with all of that said, if it's not going to slow down, so the issue is how do we relate to these smartphones? How do we relate to this technology? Is that the real issue? Is it, you can't necessarily solve the content, but we can solve our own personal relationships? Is that an accurate depiction of your thesis?
Yeah. I should also preface that I don't recommend anybody look at this. And actually, the feedback that I got immediately when I sat down my first official session as a PhD student, is like, what my supervisor told me: calm down, nobody's going to read this. I promise I will. And if you're lucky, your examiners might. But I know that Joey had actually sat down and looked into this. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. But I think the sort of the gist of it, and the short that you've given people is correct. I think it gets very technical, and unfortunately, when I then started, set out to study how do people create these identities on Instagram or on social media, how do they actually do it, what's sort of the content. I was interested in the content, if we want to stay with this duality, but I realized that it's almost impossible to get at this, and before we get at this, understanding the how, in terms of me as a physical body with a piece of silicon transistors sandwiched between two sort of pieces of glass and with an Apple logo, right? How I engage with this, and how this thing attracts me, pulls me away from the physical environment into a virtual environment, and what the physical environment around me does and doesn't do, because it is augmented in a way by the tools that I have around me that give me access to the virtual environment. And the very simple argument, or perhaps one to kind of get this problem across that we're dealing with here, is the fact that the phone's on the table, and it's sort of it could potentially ring, or it could vibrate. That already constitutes using the phone, from what I believe in now, because you're monitoring it, right? There probably is a reason that you removed it from Do Not Disturb, so that it can send you a message, because you're waiting something. So that's part of it. And that means that at any moment in time, this world can pull you in. So that's sort of the general idea. Now back to the question about the sort of the software developers and the engineers. I'm not a Luddite. I don't hate technology, and in fact, I come from very much enjoying my smartphone. I've probably given myself this blank check, just like, because I study it, I can do whatever I want, but I'm very guilty of doom scrolling, whatever the trendy term for whatever it is, right? I do use it very excessively. I don't think that the problem is the technology per se. There are two things that we need to see here. There's people who develop technologies because you can develop them, And then sometimes there are moral and ethical discussions. But at the end of the day, in the hard sciences and engineering sciences, it's a rat race. It's a real competition. And if you don't develop it, then someone else will develop it before you. So you could arguably say, let's develop it first before someone else does bad stuff with it. And I don't see why, if you think back to the BlackBerry, which had the most, if we're honest with ourselves, the most important things. You have mobile internet, you can quickly Google something, you can use maps, and you can use some form of digital communication. An updated version of this could probably look, we don't know how this would look like because the smartphone form factor has taken over, right? But this is powerful, and this solves probably 80% of the daily uses that we have with the device. A company like BlackBerry, they don't care what we do with the device as long as we're good people and we buy the new device when it comes out, and we also buy the BlackBerry watch and we buy the BlackBerry home speaker and whatever, right? They just want us to buy the hardware. Different problem with overconsumption, but inherently they don't care if we use it in a way that is sort of enhancing our lives and makes us happy, or if we use it in a way that makes us perhaps sad or less connected to people or tired or whatever it is that you're struggling with. The people supplying the software for free that you install on the device, now they have an interest. They have an interest in this. So if we were to, and perhaps this is then when we get to political action, if let's say one of the big players, and I've been name dropping a lot, right? I don't know whether that's allowed or not. But if, one of the big usual suspects, let's say the big three companies that produce our daily personal devices, if one of them had a slogan out there that said, our new phone, now less addictive, I think consumers would flock to that, and they, all the other producers would have no choice but to implement that as well. So I don't think it's necessary, given that the engineers have to use their powers for evil or for something that sucks us in more.
Do you think that day's coming? Do you think that I'm probably a little bit biased, but I can see this day almost like the beer companies, advertising against drunk driving. Do you think that, because to your point, the manufacturers don't necessarily have, I guess you could, if you use Apple as an example, maybe in the App Store, there would be fewer downloads of paid apps or something. So maybe they would lose some revenue there. But to your point, it doesn't seem like they have a huge incentive for you to use your device more because you're going to buy it. So do you think that day is coming when a manufacturer takes a stand like that, or even maybe on a lesser degree, a cell phone carrier?
Yeah. In terms of network and cell phone carriers, I think this is something that's a bit out of my range, but I think that could potentially happen because they also have an incentive to reduce the peak time usage of their networks and to just kind of reduce load overall. I will say that, of course, people who produce devices like Samsung, Apple, or Huawei, they also have an incentive in us using it because they also get feedback and they also get protocols, right? Yep. But this is not, so this is something to keep in mind. It depends on how salient this issue is for people, because you can probably remember, and I think it was the recent campaign of the white X with the black font and the simple design that said more privacy, which I'm not going to call it hypocrisy, but the irony that you're basically signing over your firstborn child and everything you ever own and you will know, and it's advertised with privacy. That's ingenious, and that's very much like the smoking campaigns or the drunk driving campaigns. So I think we see this, and there is pressure, and this pressure at some point resulted in people, or like emerged from people being unhappy, from people like Zuckerberg being dragged in front of like some kind of jury and being interrogated, and people making memes about it and people talking about it. So of course, but this is happening very slowly, and I am not sure that we are there just yet, because we have this, we still have this incentive to participate in social media, don't we? Right? It's not just all bad. It's enjoyable as well. And whether it's for turning off your brain or for thinking that could be your life, or for actually sort of living the digital American dream and trying to make it and get like all the followers and whatever, I think it's a bit less obvious than someone just using your data against your will and tracking you. So I'm not sure that we will immediately get as large a coalition of the willing for that.
Well, it's what we find constantly is the people who are joining Aro are really doing it with, moms and dads, for example, are doing it for the betterment of the next generation. Oh, for me, gosh, I got to be on for work, or I have to be on. And that's probably a little bit of rationalization on their own part, but they are genuinely saying, I want this to be better for my kids after me. But at the same time, you have this tension because virtually every 2-year-old I've ever seen in a restaurant has a screen in front of their face at the table. Right. And so it's, to your point, it's almost like you're balancing out how painful is it. Do I really want, I want a quiet dinner, so I'll let my kid have a screen at the table. You have to have a little bit more of a far-sighted approach in order to really address it. And to your point, it is probably just a pain tolerance. How painful does it become? And on top of that, it's really fun. They're really great. It's like it's like the ice cream industry is not out of business yet because it's so delicious, even though we know it doesn't do great things to your body.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a fantastic observation, and I would even go so far that they're so great. There's reasons to give your young child a tablet, for example, because there's great opportunity for learning, for developmental support, for all of these things, right? So there are fantastic applications for it. It's always a question of how much, and then of what exactly is happening. But I don't know whether I'm allowed to but I have had a question for a while, because we talked about sort of journeys, and we've talked about sort of like dreams and realizations and turning that into mission. And I think with Aro, you're doing exactly that. And you talking about the future generation. It's my understanding that this idea and this product was born out of a realization for future generations as well, right?
It was, and it was born in many ways for me. And I think a lot of people look at it, I want my kids to have good relationships with technology, because that's what you said it earlier. I love my phone. We're not going to get rid of our phones. They're really beneficial to us. They're really helpful for our lives. They do get in the way of some of our best intentions, I find. And so for me, the thing that I was working to preserve, and this really, when my kids were, I felt this pain when my kids were probably 5 and 3 years old, and probably even before then. So I wasn't necessarily at that time looking for, I want them to have good relationships with their phones. I was thinking more towards the future of, I want them to have a good relationship with me. So it was a little bit inward focused, and saying that I am getting in the way of a future relationship. So I looked at it towards the future and a future relationship. Now it's been super helpful as my kids, who are now almost 15 and 13, they've had Aro since before they had phones. And so there's this great opportunity for parents, for example, to teach, to model for kids how to have a good relationship with your phone. So I had a window to do that. And then it was for them, it's a natural muscle memory for them to put their phone away from them, which I believe one of your core principles, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the really only effective way to spend less time on your phone is for you to not see it and for it to not be with you. Is that correct? Do you still hold to that?
Yeah. So this is what I've observed in a sort of non-controlled setting, and this is what I'm currently trying to look at. You know how it is with scientists. Take our time, and we need to play a bit of our glass bead game and play around a little bit. But this is the only thing that seems to be working quite reliably. And it's great that you say this, because my thought process now, also what I wanted to discuss is, it's really interesting. You mentioned the kids in a restaurant, and how much pain can you tolerate? How annoying isn't it easier to kind of give them a tablet, and so they stop, and the other people around the table and the other tables don't look. But if we think back, if there's a child, and a child is loud and it makes noises and it's fun and whatever, it draws attention from other tables. And it's not necessarily negative, right? Usually as a parent, I'm not a parent, but I've heard enough about, like, you feel embarrassed, and you're like, oh God, don't do it, come here, don't do this. Usually the other, I mean, I have a dog, and dogs run around in restaurants as well, and like, you're embarrassed, but the other people, oh, this is so great, right? So I think we're looking at this as an individual level problem, and I completely understand it when you have to look after a child, when you see this is the future, this is where it's going, right? I need to teach them a healthy way of dealing with these devices, and I myself am struggling, right, to deal with them healthily. So I can understand that this feels a bit hopeless. But if we think about this as an individual level problem, right, then we're never going to beat the people who have an interest in getting our individual attention and our individual resources and knowledge and data, because this is not just an individual level problem. If your children don't grow up speaking to strangers in a safe, normal setting, how do they know then how it goes? How this works? What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? How do we want to engage in public space? Agoraphobia, that goes back to the agora in Greece, which is, the place where you walk around and chat and talk because you're bound to be there. So you meet people. In Zimmel's world, in the big cities that we live in now, you don't engage with people. And especially in bigger cities, you have this great big love for the abstract other, and we try to be nice to each other abstractly. But if you've ever used public transport here, people are ruthless to the people around them because they hate everyone and they're stressed, right? So this, and we're disengaging. And now to go full circle, I don't see 2 or 3 year olds. Well, maybe 2 or 3 year olds are interested in the newspaper if you're holding it because they want to participate, right? Getting 6 or 7 or 8 year olds to read the newspapers, right? You go, good luck trying, right?
Right.
The media format is less interesting. The same with books nowadays. But the smartphone, that comes naturally and that comes automatically. So when we have a format that there's an intrinsic desire to deal with because it holds so much opportunity, then we cannot ignore this. And my feeling would be we cannot think about this as an individual level problem.
That's really interesting because you are right. We're gonna immediately. You have to be very self-aware from an individual basis to know that this is, the sacrifice of what you want now for what you want later. That's a really challenging thing. And we're all relying, even if we have that great intention, then we're relying in the moments on pure willpower. Just am I strong enough to not hand my child a smartphone while they're screaming at a restaurant? That's a really hard thing to do in the moment. So what I think I hear you saying is we're going to have to look beyond just ourselves as individuals and understand that maybe, is it safe to say, our contribution as individuals contribute to a much greater good, and so you have to look at it on a societal level. Did I hear that somewhat correctly?
Yes, absolutely. Right. Especially now in times where, we see the social fabric tearing at places. And we see that a lot of things that were consensus from, let's say, the 50s onwards until the maybe late 80s are not consensus anymore. Then even more so, we need to find elements that connect us and that pull us together. And I think we're doing a reasonably good job at doing this. However, we're not doing this in a I speak with you and you speak with me manner, in a way where we can go out and we can debate with each other.
Right.
Rather, we're isolating ourselves, where I engage in my device and you engage in yours, what we're currently doing, which is great because we're very far apart, so we couldn't do it otherwise.
Right.
But if we continuously engage with this mode, well, then we're only one step away from bubbles and echo chambers and so on. And then eventually it becomes so difficult to get into a mode of exchanging, of accepting knowledge and of accepting stuff that's difficult and painful potentially, that is going to be very difficult to recover from this state.
It does seem like that. And you said something that was interesting when you described a scenario where we were let's say an online discussion with each other, and you said we're interacting with our device. I'm interacting with my device. You're interacting with your device, but we're not. I don't know if you meant this intentionally or not, but we weren't interacting with each other. We were only interacting with our own devices, maybe bouncing our own opinion within our own echo chamber that's bouncing up against somebody else's echo chamber. And there's no actual interaction between the individuals. It's just interaction with devices. That's a really interesting way to concept that.
Yeah. This goes back to the semiotic triangle. I mean, the idea is we have a shared object of attention, a shared object of intentionality. There's a rock or some kind of little caterpillar that does interesting stuff, and we sit next to each other and we look at it. And if we look at each other, we know that we're looking at the same thing. Whereas if we're in a group chat and we open the next link, the same link, we look at the same thing, but it's not the same thing because I look at it through my lens and you look at it through your lens. And of course, that raises questions for shared intentionality, that sort of increases the sort of the primate of the I, of the me over the group. And this is something that is, in a way, surprisingly recent, because if you look at sort of ideal type photos, maybe you need to look at old furniture catalogs. But what you would see is families sitting around the radio in the living room, and there is one thing that gives you mediated information, or it would be one person reading a book to their children, or it would be one TV, and you have your TV dinner because it's the 80s and you're stressed already, and we're already sort of in an accelerating society, but we still have this one object that we focus on, that we cuss at, or that we sort of, cry over, that we laugh about, that we get our emotions from. But this has disappeared virtually. And if that is still the case, and you're guilty of that too, I'm sure, right? Then you have your second screen in your hand, and that's the main thing, but you're actually entertaining yourself with something else. So that then question that goes back to when we said, what is the physical space around you? What is even this sort of reality that we're inhabiting? When the reality that I'm inhabiting is, doom scrolling through some kind of shoes, whereas you listening to some kind of, or checking out some music that you want to listen to. So the space that we inhabit, even though we may be physically co-present, is not the same space anymore. And now I've only given you very innocent examples that may be trivial and perhaps also can lead to, a more, I guess we're too old for this now, but sort of teenagers hanging out together. They're in the same room, they listen to some music, and they engage with their devices and share things and look at things together and show each other something here and there. This can be really nice, nice exchange as well. But if this goes with information that is completely diametrically opposite to what you're consuming, then of course this can become slightly more problematic. And if we're then in a space where we have to engage with each other, but we don't really know how to, because we've not learned how to do it, or we haven't practiced it in a long time, then it becomes very complicated.
This seems like it has to, and I don't want to be, again, we keep a pretty positive outlook, but what you just described, that seems like inevitably that has to disintegrate community. That has to, whether that's community of two partners or of a family or of a large social group, that there's no way around that, right? It has to erode a community, or maybe not even erode it, but never lead to building of a community. Is that accurate? I mean, am I being too doomsday-ish there? But how on earth can you build a community if everybody's next to each other but consuming different pieces of information, and so there's no commonality?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fantastic question for anybody who wants to do a PhD. I think this is a great starting point. I think I see two things there. One is a very, unfortunately, bleak and forward answer that yes, the way we are currently engaging with media, the way that media is currently directed at us, and the way we're handling devices, that's very complicated, and I don't see how this is good for creating community. There are counterexamples, for example, with large global WhatsApp groups that, for example, have formed amongst Uber drivers, or at Deliveroo, not Uber drivers, but like the cyclists on their e-bikes, in the gig economy, that have used this to create global networks and to actually, fight back against the machine, because individually you don't. But so this can also spontaneously, and we've seen social uprisings lately, starting with the Arab Spring, where this is used for good. It can also create small, interesting local communities, community watch, or you try to look at after a community garden or whatever. So there are these great local uses, but they tend to be very local, and they tend to be very community focused and intentional, and often also rallied against an issue. That's the bleak sort of sad. The other option is, and that's one that I'm also guilty of sort of contributing to, is whenever someone says technology and the future, you see Keanu Reeves flying through the Matrix being chased, and it's the only way, right? It's the same. We can imagine the end of the world, and Hollywood sells us this 4 times a year, but we can't imagine the end of, and this is not a pure capitalism problem, but that is much harder in the current system that we're in. And so there are some scholars trying to work on something like fully automated luxury communism. This sounds very, very lovely. It's a very good term. I don't think you need to make this about the political spectrum.
Sure.
But the idea is, can we create an imaginary, some sort of artistic rendition even, that imagines the future where the machines don't try to sort of suck the blood out of us and kill us and we have to find them, but where there actually is a way where we develop technologies that help us and support us, and that indeed allow us to live perhaps a more leisurely and more fulfilled life, that allow us to produce more sustainably, and so on and so on. And very rarely do we get media renditions, also because, chaos and a fight and a good hero is enticing. But the idea is, can we even create an imaginary like this? And so there's a great call right now, and I think there's some movement for artists and for visionaries and for imaginaries. Just how could this even look like? Because we know that automatic doors and any type of laser pointer, any type of GPS, all the cool stuff that we have nowadays has been designed by kids who watch Star Trek. Right. That's sort of the argument. It's a very gross simplification, right? But as a kid, oh, that should be cool. Maybe I can do it, right? So if we only see a fight and a struggle against the machine, then all we can come up with better ways to fight and struggle. But perhaps there are ways to create imaginaries as well, where indeed it doesn't have to be this way. And how could this look like? And perhaps this can then inspire new groups of engineers, scientists, and also social scientists to think of products of societies and of societal technologies, social technologies, to reach a point that's slightly more sustainable and slightly more humane.
Amazing. That's fascinating. And you're right. You do. All the kids, you're right. You got to figure out how to fight the machines. And so if you can imagine something different that you can kind of innovate towards, that's a little more of a hopeful future. Maxi, real quick, and we'll edit this out. What is your time constraint? We're
good. We're good.
Are you good? Okay.
Yeah,
I think we may even make this one 2 parts, because I got a handful more. So 20-ish, 25 more minutes.
Yeah,
okay.
Let me have a quick sip of water.
And Caitlin, you may want to let the team know that we're probably trending towards like 10:10 or 10:15.
When I go to speak faster, I don't want to keep you.
No, this is wonderful. I mean, this is amazing. It really, I mean, literally, these are my notes, and I'm about right here right now. So and I won't hit all of them, but I do want to. We'll dive into it. So we'll jump back in here. Maxi, real quick before we jump, I want to get into some of your findings and your studies, because they're fascinating. But you alluded to this earlier, and this may require a little bit of vulnerability. But how has, in studying all of this, how has it affected your relationship with technology, if at all? And when I say your relationship, maybe just practically your usage. And then the follow-up is, are you content with how you currently use your smartphone yourself, having, knowing more than 99.9% of people in the world about this?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the percentage, but I have thought about this. I have thought about this a lot. To be honest, I think sort of halfway through my research work, I had a very old phone, an old iPhone, I should say, that I had, for some reason, I changed the battery myself, and it was one of those glass back ones back when they were still breaking all the time. So I had found a cheap replacement back, because I didn't want to pay $100 for that. So I had to kind of tape it shut, and it was all a bit weird and wonky and broken. And one of my colleagues told me, I think I commented on her using contactless, like Apple Pay. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. Yeah, my phone doesn't have that. And she's like, you're lacking a bit of street cred there, right? You're talking to me about smartphones, right? But you don't actually have a novel device. So I sort of, ever since then, I try to sort of keep, updated and see what's happening. I used to have this big desire, and perhaps you remember this as well, the smell of unboxing new technology items, and getting something new and cool, and always having a new device. This has kind of subsided a little bit. But I do need to push myself to kind of stay engaged. In terms of my use, the reality also is, at the end of the day, as an academic, you're a glorified secretary sending around emails all day, back and forth, all emails. So there's only so little that I can do. I find myself so occupied by my computer that I don't have much time to engage with my phone, frankly. But then in the evenings, I sometimes end up, noticing that I probably wanted to go to bed earlier and that it's quite late, and ended up scrolling something or reading something. Part of the time it's useful, part of the time it's not. But I don't have this immediate urge to kind of scold myself for that, because I've already lost the time, so I don't need to be mean to myself. But I can probably say this from a position where it's I don't have enough time to actually waste too much time.
Yeah.
And thinking back of how much time I spent when I still had more time when I was in school, then I think I would have been more frustrated. The other thing is perhaps I also rely a little bit, rest on my laurels, saying that I know what I do. I probably should take it a bit more seriously.
Well, I did again. This is to me. This is it's such an individual journey for everybody. Where it's people say, "Oh, I know I shouldn't doom scroll at night." Well, I don't know that if you wanted to, if someone were to say, "I've had a long day. I'm gonna sit here and scroll for 30 minutes." I think go ahead, more power to you. It's sometimes, to your point, if it gets in the way of those other things that you intend to do. To me, it's the distinction is like, did it get in the way of your intention? And if your intention truly is to scroll for 30 minutes an hour, that's I think more power to you. So that does make sense. I was curious if it's impacted at all, but it sounds like you're a little bit too busy to even
There are two problems. I completely agree, and this is very much perhaps there's this sort of this cathartic moment for me here as now that I'm realizing this. One thing is, if I sit down and want to scroll for 30 minutes, very rarely it's 30 minutes.
Sure.
Longer. That's one problem. And the other thing is as well, and this is I haven't found conclusive evidence, and I'm not comfortable calling this addiction, especially with this all smartphone. There's 200 smartphone addiction scales, and everybody says it's addiction because they try to get some, but it just doesn't work. And the way it's tested with self-report, it doesn't make sense anyway. But I can tell you that everybody who's seriously addicted to, let's say, gambling, let's say any type of substance, that they, after a long day, say, oh, now I can finally do XYZ, and there is a desire and they want to do this. But part of you wanting to do this also is because you're so habituated, let's say. I wouldn't necessarily say addicted, but so habituated, because after a long day of work, your reward is to sleep deprive yourself. That's the way of spinning it as well. So perhaps there is something to be done there.
I want to go a little. That was a big question I had that towards the end, but I want to jump into that because it's such an interesting question, and maybe the semantics aren't quite as important, but I think it does matter when we talk about phone usage. I have this belief, and it's not scientific, that the vast majority of us have a set of bad habits that we've learned. The iPhone's 15 years old. We've learned this behavior. I tend to stray away from saying, hey, we're addicted to our phones, even though that's the easy thing to say. And one of the reasons why we say that is because I think that people just lack a system. They like a plan. They like a good environment that would make an actual difference. And when, in a way, when you say I'm addicted, it releases some form of your own personal control over it, where I say, like, no, it's actually habitual, maybe it's compulsive. And again, I know it'd be easy to go down a wormhole, but will you expound a little bit more on your belief? Do we have a bad habits, or do we have an addiction? Truly, is this for the average phone user who's on their phone 5 or 6 hours a day? I would love for you to go a little bit deeper on this discussion on habit versus addiction or compulsion.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything that I've been working on, that I have been publishing, very much argues for the habit case. It's habits, it's routines that we've developed, some of them useful, some of them not useful, some of them perceived as a decision, some of them cued automatically because there's environmental responses. There may be things that you do because I'm going to get my phone, no, do this and this and this. I'm sure you've also waited for public transport or waited for a friend somewhere, and you will find yourself with your phone in hand. And that decision to take it out and to see what's there is not necessarily, at least I don't perceive it as like, oh, yes, Maxi now wants phone. Right? It's not so clear that I talk to myself, I'm now doing this. It just sort of happens automatically. In terms of addiction, and this is not published yet, and also this is I haven't looked into this direction, because there's also the neurobiologists, and there's also other people that you need to get into place with fMRI scans, and like much smarter people than I. So it's with the tools that I use, I can't conclusively say.
Sure.
But what I've seen from naturally emerging data is that standard theories of what addiction would look like actually don't work, because this when you let users self-select when they record themselves. So you get self-selected snapshots. And in these self-selected snapshots, they use the phone whenever they want to. What we see is when they don't use it, then they use it for short times and not so frequently. And when they use it, then they use it for long times and a lot. This can, of course, correlate with what exactly it is that people are doing, because it depends on different activities. But the typical addiction pattern would be, at some point you need your fix, and indeed you have this build-up, right? You have this build-up of intensity where you're trying and going for it, and then eventually you have to get that release. There's the metaphor that's being used of the like a bathtub dripping, fulfilling, like getting fuller and fuller, and eventually it flows over and it needs to flush out. And this typically applies to the most basic needs: food, using the restroom, sex, all of these desires, right, that we have as an animalistic sense, and once you're done with it, then you're happy, and then you can move on to other things. But this is what, at least from this very cursory data that I have, that's not controlled, this is what it seems to look like. So I'd be very careful with it. And then think about what you yourself said. It doesn't feel like addiction.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like you can, but your life is set up in a way that you don't need to put it away, and that there are so many opportunities that you can pick it up. So this is the angle that I think is more productive, at least for now, before we figure out whether indeed there's some type of other thing going on.
And this is where we begin, is if it's, I know, and this is an interesting, I don't know that I've mentioned this to you before, but I've found when I have my phone with me, and I've been using Aro and I've been building the system, we've been working on this for years. And so even now, 3 or 4 years after having some form of Aro, if I have my phone with me, I'm still not very good at ignoring it or not initiating my own behavior with it. When I'm away, I've found that I have much more prolonged periods away from my phone where I don't think about it. It's not a big deal. I built that muscle around it. But when I do have it with me, it's constantly beckoning me. And I love what you said earlier. Even just having it there, in a sense, you are using it when it's present with you. And so I say all of that. It kind of confirms what you're saying there, but it doesn't feel like an addiction when I'm away from it. And this is what we found with most people it's an instant impact when you're away from your phone, when you have a system, when you have Aro in your home, for example. This is not a commercial at all for Aro, but anybody who spends or puts their phone in a shoebox and has the willpower to do that, you actually get better at it pretty instantaneously, which I would assume is also not typical of addiction. You don't really improve instantly with that.
Yeah. And I mean, what I've seen, I work with video recordings, first-person recordings. It doesn't even have to be a shoebox. I've seen so many people working on things absolutely frustrated, just throwing the phone behind them, hoping it hits the sofa or the bed, right? So just getting it out of reach, getting out of reach of a little bit can help already.
I want to segue into some of your findings, and you've had some just fascinating stats, and I use them and give you credit for them all the time. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on these. One of them I found in your findings is that the participants that within your studies, they interact with their phones about every 5 minutes, regardless of context, about every 5 minutes. But the thing that was most notable about that was when you told them that, and they were shocked and even unhappy about that. Is that correct? I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And it's not the usage is one thing, but it's their perception of their own usage, which was most interesting to me.
Yeah. So this is the average and the aggregate over multiple participants and over multiple days. So I think what this probably looks like in reality is more where you have like more frequent interactions. And then when you're walking for somewhere from A to B, then it might be 10, 15 minutes, but it added up to this. And, it's so beautiful. I couldn't have forged it better myself, that it's, 1 minute every 5 minutes, sort of, if we sum it up, which then goes to 60.
Wow.
But yeah, even more so than just showing them statistics, because that happened afterwards. What we did was sit down with people and talk to them about their recordings. So I spend a lot of time, and I will thankful to my participants for the time that they've given me, rewatching this footage. And I've done it myself as well. It can sometimes be painful and embarrassing, because having to see yourself do the stuff that you do, right? That's not the easiest. And most of the time we had the typical, hands go up in the air. Oh my God, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? I absolutely am not thinking what's going on here. And so this was then what pushed forward that, okay, let's actually look at how much time they spend there. And a lot of people are surprised at the context when they use it and how frequently they use it. And yeah, I mean, there's so much great richness in human experience that you can get out of qualitative data. People saying, "Oh, I'm so lost here at the end of the day. Please, can someone get me out of my misery?" I think that's one of the quotes. And they take the phone and saying, "Oh no, can someone get me out of my misery?" Because they don't want to engage with the stuff that their daily job is, giving them. So yeah, no, it's very fascinating stuff, and it's very authentic sentiments that you get from
Yeah.
people, and perhaps this also resonates with some people listening in.
I'm so glad that there's not a video on me showing my phone interaction. I mean, I will stop. I think a lot of us, I'll interrupt myself mid sentence. You'd be speaking if and something pops up and I'm holding my phone. It's a mid sentence distraction. My daughter gave me a hard time for this the other day. She goes, "Dad, are you going to finish your sentence?" And here I was, just engulfed in something totally different. Back to your point, I was physically present, but just completely in a different place. This is one of my favorites, and it's, to me, shocking and also hopeful. You say that 89% of smartphone interactions are initiated by the user and only 11% by the phone itself, by the notifications of the phone. That's, I think, probably opposite of what most people would guess. I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I mean, this completely shocked us as well when we ran some initial, because it takes a long time to analyze the data. So what we did was to kind of look at what's going on and see whether you can even use the data, run after coding one participant to see, and you start to see these numbers build up, and it just stays this way. And initially you think, oh, maybe this is just because you haven't gone through all the data. But yeah, I mean, you said it already, but this is how I usually start when I talk to people, when I talk about my research. Usually people have sat in a room for a long time already, and I say, "Hi, who of you thinks their phone is distracting them and annoying them and pulling them away?" And usually 3/4 of the room say like, "Yeah, here, me." And then I ask, who of you has checked their phone already? And most people say, "Yes, I've checked my phone today." And then, who has their phone on Do Not Disturb? And then all the hands go up, because you sit somewhere in a meeting room. And of course, it's not supposed to vibrate or make noises, whatever. But you need to check it, because you're on, and I think one participant called it, you're on a downwards escalator, right? If you don't straddle, if you don't keep on walking, the messages piling on top of you just get more and more and more and more, and you miss stuff, and someone else, like, so there's this fear of missing out, not just in the social Kardashian sense, but in the sort of personal sense of missing out on what's happening and not being seen as being on top of your stuff. Some jobs, especially junior jobs, also being available, being ready, and going the extra mile is part of getting forward, getting ahead, and being seen as being useful. So being constantly reachable. We've all internalized this very much. So it's not a surprise that people proactively try to, they mute their phone because they don't want it to go off, and it's annoying, but at the same time they have to proactively check. And that perhaps explains a little bit the regularity as well with which we check, because you need to check, and every 5 minutes you're probably likely to have a moment where you're not focused on a task, but you take a little break. And you end up with the phone, and that's the final comment that we get from actually, I think, almost every participant. You end up with it in hand much more than you would like to.
Right. And why is, I think I know just by that, this has been a curious follow-up to that, which is the do not disturb function. You mentioned that you propose that may actually be counterproductive to reducing screen time. Is that because when it's on do not disturb, for example, you don't know what's coming in, at least when you're getting notifications, when something has come to you, right? So when it's on do not disturb, you don't know, and so as a result you just check more. Is that why it's counterproductive?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. I think there's many different technical solutions to it, but clearly having all the notifications on and waiting for a lot of important notifications, but not having any sort of actually being delivered, and therefore constantly checking the phone, that's a typical problem. So if it's if you, I don't know, maybe you have your, the iPhone has this function where you're allowed special context to call through Do Not Disturb. I presume
Sure.
that your children, your family are on that, right? So that gives you peace of mind. If I'm waiting for an important delivery or an important message, and so I need to leave the phone on, but at the same time, I have all my other apps sending me notifications about absolutely pointless stuff, then I'm not winning either. And there's
Right.
fantastic work by colleagues in the engineering space and the software engineering space as well that try out whether you can batch notifications and deliver them in different ways and try to make notification delivery itself more unobtrusive. And so this is in itself, in the lab it works really well, but then there's two nails in the coffin. One is my finding: people just put it on do not disturb, so
Right.
the entire elaborate system doesn't work. Um, and the other one is that a lot of this stuff, like if you think back to maybe 5 years ago, we have so much more opportunities now in nuancing different do not disturb, in muting things and whatever. But there's a lot of studies as well that people want more options, but
Huh.
they also don't use these options because they can't be bothered to play with them, right? And they don't care about this stuff. And like, whenever you're asked to, oh, review your settings, and you see the menu and you go like, no, yes, 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 I just want to get to it, right? So one is people put it on do not disturb. The other one is if people are given the choice, they don't use it. Again, this is a lab finding, but this is another problem then. So it's difficult to engineer our way out of this if the engineering is not the problem.
Right. So as people are looking at this, and you give a great driver's license analogy, just needing more training, people needing more training, not necessarily a smartphone license, but needing more training in general. And then as I've read some of your conclusions on your studies, which again are fascinating, and by the way, they're academic, but they're so insightful, and I would encourage people to go look into them. You talk about people identifying, defining the environmental factors that trigger us to use our phones, and then you say that we may need to relearn how to engage with our devices healthily. That seems to a lot of people like a very sizable undertaking to be that introspective and to go do that. So how practically, as you see it play out for the person who is struggling with that tension of, hey, I want to engage more in the present, and I feel like my phone's taking me away from that, how do you really go through and have that self-assessment and then begin to develop that habit? What are some effective ways you've seen for people to be able to put that into practice, into practical life?
Yeah. I think there's the first problem with academia and the ivory tower, that, there's a lot of work on this, and there's all these smart people that say, we should look into this, right? And I'm not including myself here, but I have said we should look into this. But then have I done this? No, because I don't have the time for it. But this is sort of the next big step that we need to look into. Um, I think this also goes back a little bit to what you were saying, because this is very much a generational task as well. Because this is something that we can foster in schools, in parent-child relationship, potentially in social relationships as a society, as a public, where we can ask these questions: where do we want to go? Where we see, and usually leveraging children, which are generally innocent and seen as innocent as well, and seeing the world that we're giving them and presenting them with and forcing them to grow into, seems to be a strong factor. Teaching this at an early age, I think, is really important. The other side for us and probably most listeners who aren't children, the only way is friction. The only way is increasing friction, and it's shown that it's not the perfect solution. It's shown that, like, these apps that either limit your time, or there's physical solutions which you propose. There are physical solutions that involve throwing the phone away. But the only thing really is friction and reflection on what it is that you're actually doing, taking the time to looking into the settings, taking the time to listen in a little bit and to see what it is that you're doing and what your problem is, whether that is affecting your relationship with your partner because you're both sort of sitting in bed and scrolling with the phone and you'd rather be doing something else, or whether you'd rather be reading a book but you're tired after the day and you end up scrolling and you don't get to reading the book even. It's a lot of introspection. It's a lot of these incomplete friction tools that will be problematic, but that will help you. And it's painful and difficult.
Yeah.
And to avoid other people who are growing into this just now having to do this, then we have to see and work extensively with schools and with children's, I think, and with children and with policymakers, to see if there's a way of teaching people how to pick it up in the correct way to do your homework, and then also when you've looked up the stuff that you needed to look up on Wikipedia, to put it back down and not end up on whatever mobile game you're playing or social media.
Right. I love that. And you're right. It did that friction and reflection. And it again, just like anything that's valuable in life, it will require a little bit of pain. And that's the same with healthy relationships and a healthy diet and exercise. And probably to some degree, it's just that part of that reflection, I believe, is probably just taking it seriously. Right now, it's very casual. And if we take it a little bit more seriously, to your analogy on the driver's license, we take it a little bit more seriously, then hopefully we can accept the fact that it will be a little bit difficult and continue to strive towards something that is hard, knowing that it won't ever be perfect, but that it can be better.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're at a very early stage with this stuff. I don't want to be saying this, but like,
Yeah,
I too used to dial in, and I remember the sound of the 56K modem,
of
right?
course.
And like these things, and the fact that it's here, I think, I don't know, one of the Google like CEOs or COOs in 2015 said, the internet's going to be gone in 5 years or 10 years. It's just like air or water. It's just around us. We don't notice it anymore. And I think we're slowly reaching this area as well. This time now, and it's very difficult to put yourself into these shoes, but you need to think about the early, the 1910s, the stuff that was developed back then. I think back then a lot of chemicals were new, and you could buy heroin in the pharmacist just as a cough syrup, right?
Wow.
And then a problem developed, and then we started regulating it, and there's all these other things that we've learned about. I think it's fair as well to realize that we think we're so in control and we're so in charge. But at the end of the day, these are completely novel technologies that have caused massive social restructuring and upheaval. And it's okay that it takes time to learn this as a society. And in that sense, just from a pure social level, I think that the society, as in the people that it is made of, will realize what is good and what is useful, and what causes problems, and for what we need regulation.
Right.
Now, reconciling that with economic and political interests, that then is another debate.
That'll be interesting. That the debate for the future, that'll be heated for sure. Max, we've taken up a huge amount of your time. I think this will probably be a two-parter. This is so rich. But I want to close with one question. And Aro is here to help people put down their phones so that they can align their actions with their intentions, so they can live out the intentions they have for their lives. And I'm just curious. A question we ask everybody, a lot to ask you, is what is intentionality? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. It's a tough one, and I have a feeling that I should have a better answer prepared, given that I work so much on this. I think I would very much go with the sort of textbook idea that intentionality is the taking a break in whatever flow of activity, taking a break in the run of what's happening, and actually thinking about, what do I want to do? What am I doing here? Nietzsche has a great analogy. What if you are, if you were to grow up alone, stranded on an island like Robinson Crusoe? There's no Friday, right? And everything's perfect. You can eat, you can drink. You don't need to worry about this. Why are you wearing clothes? Who is that? Was that your idea, or did someone teach you that? Why are you drying some kind of herb that you found somewhere, and rolling it up and fermenting barley juice and sort of like consuming it? Why are you doing all of these things, right? Why are you putting stuff on your face? Like all of these like very like cultured and social elements. So thinking, reflecting on this at a deeper level, I think that's intentionality for me, at the higher level. For me personally, because my work is so much on what people do in natural context, I find it very difficult to think about intentionality, because it's all about natural habits. It's all about things evolving naturally. And if I see from the recordings what people do and how we navigate through our lives, and I myself have been recorded, and people have been noticing, like you're like being pulled on a string from one to the next. And there's things around you, objects that are calling you to do specific things. You're going upstairs, you pick up the laundry because it's already there, and then there's the next thing, and there's the next thing. So for me, there's a big question how much I actually live with intentionality, and that's sort of at the meta level then.
Sure.
And this is something that I think I personally certainly want to get better at, being aware of what it is that I'm doing, but that we could also probably dedicate a lot more attention to understanding what intentionality means in a lived personal experience sense,
Right.
much more so than in a sort of abstract sense. I want to live more fully or whatever.
Right. Gosh, that's wonderful. That's so good. Dr. Maxi Heitmayer, it is, this has been incredible. This has been so great, so rich. Thank you for your insight, your knowledge. Thank you for your work. I love what you're doing. What an amazing thing you're working on, a huge undertaking. And thank you for everything you're doing, not just for the academic community, but for the world at large. I think your research and your work is going to have a big impact on culture. I really do. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thanks very much for the kind words, and thanks for having me, Joey.